Welcome to all our guests with me virtually this evening, and those of you who are joining us on Facebook. My name is Kathleen Callahan, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Policy and Civic Engagement for the Connecticut Cradle to Career Coalition. Waterbury Bridge to Success, Stamford Cradle to Career, Norwalk Acts, Danbury Collective, and Bridgeport Prospers are our state's 5 Cradle to Career Strive Together network partnerships who collaborate to achieve equitable outcomes and economic mobility for all children, youth, and emerging adults. One way we do that is by listening and learning directly from our youth. And tonight, we will be centering and elevating their voice with a very special guest, our Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas. Earlier this year, Stephanie Thomas joined us for a screening of The Young Vote, and my colleagues at all our partnerships thought it would be great to have a follow-up panel. We are grateful to the Secretary for her willingness to share space and discuss not only the importance and power of the youth vote, as this event is titled, but also why civics is so crucial and how it can empower their generation. Before I go backstage, I'm going to introduce Arlene Flores, our student moderator for the evening, who is representing Stamford Cradle to Career. Arlene is a recent graduate of West Hill High School, where she was involved in organizations such as Best Buddies, Interact, the West Ward, and the Mayor's Leadership Council. Arlene is now enrolled at Williams College, where she is exploring several majors and concentrations, including psychology, public health, and women's gender and sexuality studies. Prior to working with United Way Stamford Cradle to Career, she worked with Building One Community and the Stamford Government Center. Her work with United Way Stamford Cradle to Career began the summer of her senior year and was made possible through its partnership with the Mayor's Youth Employment Program, an opportunity she is tremendously grateful for and is excited about continuing with its incredible team, even if that's from a distance, like tonight. Arlene, Secretary, and all other students, have a fantastic conversation. I'll be back at the end.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Now I'll introduce Secretary Thomas. Secretary Thomas was sworn in as Connecticut's Secretary of the State on January 4th, 2023. With a distinguished 30-year career advising and problem-solving for nonprofit organizations, running her own business, and serving as a state representative of the 143rd District, Norwalk, Wilton, Westport, Secretary Thomas brings a unique blend of business expertise and a passion for civics to public service. Since taking office, Secretary Thomas has led to implementation of significant election reforms in the state, including the rollout of early voting and a new centralized voter registration system. In September 2023, she secured a historic investment of $25 million to replace the state's aging tabulators, marking Connecticut's first voting machine upgrade since 2006. During her term, Secretary Thomas will also institute the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of Connecticut and automatic voter registration at several Connecticut agencies. A former small business owner, Secretary Thomas has worked to pass business-friendly legislation, and she has created a monthly e-newsletter that aggregates funding and training resources in one place to save business owners time. Secretary Thomas believes that a healthy representative democracy relies on regular and active participation in civic life by all. To promote robust civic engagement, she has met Connecticut's communities in their own spaces, thereby cultivating a nonpartisan dialogue between the people and their government. She has traveled to barbershops and salons around the state as part of her Connect and Cut series, held civic trivia events at local libraries, encouraged businesses and nonprofits to be civic ambassadors through her innovative CEO Civically Engaged Organization program, and put the power of civics into the hands of the public by providing plain language civics resources at civics101.ct.gov. Secretary Thomas made history as the first Black person to be elected Secretary of the State of Connecticut. She has dedicated time to serving on many boards and strategic planning committees, and she has been an active volunteer in her community. She holds a BA from New York University and a MS in Nonprofit Management from New School University. She and her husband are proud residents of Norwalk, Connecticut. And now, let's have our students panelists introduce themselves. Going in alphabetical order, Bridgeport can start us off.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Ryan Wilkie. I'm a senior in Capital Prep Harbor. Yeah. Oh yeah, and I'm from Bridgeport.
Hello, I'm Ariane Aurora, and I'm a senior at Danbury High School.
Hi, I'm Ashlyn Seiler. I'm a senior at P-Tech Norwalk.
Hi, I'm Joseph French Graham. I'm a senior at Holy Cross High School, and I'm from Waterbury.
Wonderful. Now I have our first question. Madam Secretary, can you tell us why civics is such a high priority for you?
Thank you, first of all, for that very long introduction. I feel tired just hearing it, but I'm very excited to be here tonight. Civics is so important to me, I think, in particular, because I wish I knew at your age what I know now. And it took me a long time to learn it. When I think about growing up and all of the policies that impacted my life, like everyone else, I always thought of politics. I didn't really think of government. And government has a very long reach because it shapes many things about our everyday lives. I'll give you one small story. Um, I lived in affordable housing growing up. My family was very poor, so we lived in the center of town, a couple of blocks from the train station. The bus line ran down the main street, etc. And the rest of the town was very suburban, but my mom didn't drive. We didn't have a car. So living there allowed us to get around. I received a scholarship to New York University. I also received money from other schools, but they were further away. So I had to live at home and commute to NYU in the very beginning. And I realized I was only able to do that because we lived in that affordable housing and I was able to access the train to New York City. And what if we didn't live on that block? What if we lived somewhere else? Luckily, someone in government made a decision to zone part of the town for affordable housing. And I think about this often now. If those people hadn't set that policy, I would not have been able to accept my scholarship to college, and it might have changed the entire trajectory of my life. So I try to talk to people about government, not politics, and that is why not only voting is so important, but civic engagement. Policies are not written on election day. So it's really important that I teach people how to make their voice heard after the election is over, because voting is like step one. The rest is really important. And those tentacles are very, very long.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. Now, Ryan, do you have any questions for the Secretary?
Yes, I do. My question is, what can youth do before the voting age to get their peers even interested in voting or the importance of voting?
It's really difficult. Youth can do anything that adults can do except voting. I looked up some stats right before this call, and I'm gonna read them because I think it's interesting. In the 2016 presidential, I'm gonna give voter turnout stats, 2016 presidential election, 2022 statewide election. So that's when you're voting for a governor, secretary of state, your state representatives, your state senators, one of your US senators, and then 2023 when you're voting for your local leaders. So in Bridgeport, for example, participation went from 56% to 23% to 19%. In Norwalk, 78% to 51% to 27%. In Stamford, 78% to 51% to 29%. Waterbury, 55% to 39% to 23%. And Danbury, 75% to 48% to 34%. And I give those stats because so many people turn out in presidential election years, but then they stay home when we're electing all of the people who actually make most of the everyday decisions that involve our lives. Most of our policy is shaped locally and at the state level. So when voters who are 18 and older are staying home, it doesn't help us get policies that really reflect the will of the people. But this is where young people have a real opportunity. Just because you can't vote doesn't mean you're not a constituent. When I was in the legislature, people as young as second grade would show up to testify on bills. Elementary school kids, middle schoolers would send in bill ideas or send in emails and letters to say why they thought something was important. People would write to me and say, "This is going on in my high school. Could you introduce a bill on the subject?" These are all things that people of any age can do. It's also, I try to remind people that civic education is so important in terms of understanding how government is structured. And young people are used to going to class, and I say civics has to be one of those classes, because if you don't understand how government works, it's really hard. A lot of the young people I speak with are really interested in a specific issue, but they don't think about how that issue is reflected in government. For example, say you're interested in the climate crisis. Okay, but what part of it? Are you interested in a local ordinance that would forbid pesticides? Are you interested in the state's transportation committee because you want electric vehicles, or the state's energy committee because you want to invest in solar panels, or the federal government to set standards? So I think young people get really frustrated about the pace of change because they don't understand how government is organized. And unless you know how your issue plays out, local, state, and federally, it's really hard to make some of the changes that people want to see. So I happen to think educating young people, to answer your question finally, Ryan, is one of the best ways to get them involved so they start to see how specific actions lead to specific outcomes.
Thank you so much for that great answer. Now, what about Aryan? Do you have any questions?
Yeah. Why is everything so divided and polarized? Do you have tips for us on how to focus on the issues that matter instead of the people and the politics?
Yeah, I think it's up to us not to focus that way. I guess I'm in politics because I'm elected, but people always ask me, when did you decide to get into politics? And I say, I never made that decision. I decided to get into governance. Thinking politics is a convenient shorthand to lead you to understand what a candidate might represent. But government continues no matter what. So voting for someone who may represent the values of a specific political party can be helpful, but a lot of policies take a very long time to enact. So you have to chip away at it regardless of who's in office. So I think it's incumbent upon us to start focusing on government and less on the politics. And that means asking candidates not what party they belong to, but what policy they plan to support, what legislation they have supported. One thing that was a real aha moment for me, before I got to the legislature, I used to read the mailings that candidates would send me. I would go to their websites, but I was shocked when I went and actually looked at the voting record, and when I learned more about committee votes versus floor votes, etc. And we live in an amazing time of open government. So most of these meetings are either on television or the minutes are recorded. So you can actually see or read exactly what every single person who has ever held office has said. And I just found it more helpful to do that type of deep dive and figure out what policies were important to me. I don't get caught up in all the back and forth and political fights, etc. And I think if we, the voters and constituents, paid less attention to that, candidates would be forced to feed us something different. But we tend to respond to that divisiveness. So I think we all have to do better too.
Thank you for another wonderful response. Does anybody have any commentary on that? And if not, I can move on to Aislinn. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. What resources are available to me and other youth to learn more about civic engagement and get involved in our communities?
It's a good question. I jotted some notes because it's difficult. So civics usually get broken out into a few different categories, like the class that's required at the high school level. A lot of it is about what I might call the founding documents, like Constitution, Declaration of Independence, the three branches of government, how a bill is passed or laws get passed, usually at the federal level. So there's that piece of it. Then there is a lot of work around civility and how do you have political discourse without it becoming divisive. And then there's the part of it that I focus a lot on, and I call it civics you can use. It's really good to understand the founding documents, but I find I explain it like the difference between algebra and like learning percentages. I never used algebra one day after I graduated from high school, but I use percentages like every day in my life. It's good to understand the Constitution, Bill of Rights, history of this country, how it was founded, what the values and ideals are, what it means to live in a representative democracy. But it's really important for me that if someone has an issue going on in their town, they know how to affect a change, or they see a headline about something that's really important to them. So I try to provide tools that people can use so that they just have the knowledge when the time comes. That's what I think is not talked about a lot in civic education. You don't have to learn it all at once. You don't have to be an expert in it all at once, but just learn it. So when it's there, or when you have an issue, you're not like, oh my gosh, I saw this headline. What should I do? You already know. So some of the tools, we put something on our website called The Power of Civics, which you can find at powerofcivics.ct.gov. And it's about 45 different things that any single person of any age can use to gain civic knowledge. It's broken down into categories like lawmaking, how budgets get set, how government's structured, what types of interactions you can have with candidates before they're elected and after they're elected. And we break it down at the local, state, and federal level. And we include hyperlinks to helpful resources. And we always encourage people, get like a civic buddy, like get a couple of people together and say, like, you learn this tab, I'll learn this one, and let's share the knowledge, because the more you learn, the more you'll understand how your voice can be heard. There's also a group called iCivics, and they have a lot of useful tools on their website. I'm trying to think what else. On our website, We also have a civics101.ct.gov website, which, as Arlene explained, has a lot of plain language explanations about some items. And I think the best way to learn about civics is to participate, because there's a lot of things you can read about, but until you do it, it's more difficult to understand. Town meetings in most towns are recorded. You can stay home and tune into a YouTube channel and watch them. And that will teach you how people talk about issues, what different committees in town can and can't do. Every committee in the legislature in Hartford also has a YouTube channel. So, and on CTN, you can dial in, type in an issue or a subject, and see what meetings have been held. Same with the federal government and C-SPAN. So I think if you start investigating these things slowly but surely, one, people will gain more confidence about interacting with government, and you'll also learn more questions to ask and hold us all accountable.
That was an amazing response. That was very helpful. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any more, commentary regarding that? And otherwise, we can head over to Jonathan. Jonathan, did you have a question to ask?
Oh, I'm sorry, it's Joseph, by the way. Joseph.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Secretary Thomas. My name is Joseph French Graham. I'm a senior in high school in Waterbury. But just like you, my family lived in affordable housing and we weren't really well off. So growing up, my family only had one car. So it was a little bit hard for us to get around and things like that. But we still made our way to voting and to contribute to society the best way that we could. So my question to you is, what initiatives are currently in place to enhance voter accessibility and engagement in Connecticut?
Good question. Connecticut's election laws have changed a couple of times in the last couple of years. As Arlene said earlier, early voting is a huge reform that will really help accessibility. Connecticut became the 47th state in the country to have early voting. So for the upcoming election in particular, we have 2 weeks of early voting. So 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. on every day, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on 2 days throughout that 2-week period. So that when I was in the legislature, this was being voted upon, and a lot of different types of people came forth to testify. And people think of it as sometimes like a socioeconomic issue, but literally every single demographic showed up. Seniors who take medication, who don't know their good days from their bad days, people who don't have reliable transportation or have to share transportation or depend on a ride, which also applies to a lot of seniors. People who are parents of young children who said if their child woke up sick and they couldn't get a sitter or something, they couldn't go out to vote. People like me who used to commute out of Connecticut to my job and my schedule was unknown. So early voting will provide access to so many people that could not vote on a random Tuesday in November. We also the absentee ballot law changed 2 or 3 years ago, where our state constitution named sickness as a reason, but law had been set changing it to your sickness. So we were able to amend the language to restore it back to the original intent, sickness. And what that means, a good example someone gave me at the time, there was a woman, she had her baby prematurely, and the baby was in the NICU for quite some time. The election was rolling around. She had to leave the NICU to go vote because she thought it was important, but she mentioned being very conflicted because she was staying with her baby the entire, like almost 24 hours a day. Now, by saying sickness instead of your sickness, she would be able to vote by absentee ballot. So those two changes are huge. Two accessibility things that most people don't know about. Every polling place in Connecticut for the last few years has had what we call a ballot marking device. And it is for people who have, if they're low vision or blind, you have an audio ballot. You can listen to all the choices and vote that way. If you have a ailment where you need to use the sip and puff blower technology, you can vote that way. If you need help, you don't have fine motor skills control, like if you have a disease like Parkinson's, where your hand shakes, you might not be able to color in the bubble. You can use a touch screen. So that makes voting in person much more accessible to people living with disabilities. And lastly, a few years ago, the Secretary's office bought a license so that every polling place in the state has access to a live language translation app. There are over 250 languages, 100 languages. You would see a live person. The other languages, it would just be audio. So it's just a matter of asking your registrar if it's available in your town, or letting them know you need that service so they can have it downloaded and available. And that is huge. And ASL is also one of those languages. So we've been doing a lot just to make sure. Oh, and I should mention, we've been working with the Department of Corrections since I took office last year, trying to figure out how to, it's very difficult if you are currently incarcerated for a misdemeanor or in pretrial detention where you haven't lost your right to vote, but it's very difficult to vote by absentee ballot in that setting. So we've been working with them to streamline that process. In fact, this week we're doing voter registration in all of the prisons. So we have really tried to elevate accessibility across the spectrum for all people, because, we live in this beautiful country where we want everyone who's eligible to vote to be able to vote.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you ready for Facebook questions?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see what we have. Okay, so this Amario answer asks, is there a way for youth to get mentored on said topic of voting to not only get more connected and involved, but also gain more knowledge?
It's a really good question. It leads me to one comment I'm going to make that sounds kind of rude, but I don't mean it this way. I often get a question that's related to, like, it all seems so confusing. Is there one place I can go? Or is there a way to make it easier? And I like to, it sounds rude, but no, there's not. And I tell people our form of government is not going to be the one easy thing in our lives, right? Like, it's difficult to learn how to do a new job or play a sport or get along with new people. You have to figure it out. Our form of government is very complicated, but just know that if you chip away at it, you can gain that knowledge. Because no entity is really tasked with providing civic education, not even my office, there is no law that says the Secretary of the State needs to provide education to teach people how to vote. That's not a thing. But most secretaries of states want to do that because we think it's important. So because there's no entity responsible for it, there's no budget allocated for it, or very little. So it's hard. So there isn't like this one big place where everyone can go and learn this information. But there are many different nonprofits, advocacy groups, from the League of Women Voters to, Hartford Votes Coalition to many grassroots groups. Norwalk Acts and Norwalk just put together a civic ambassador type civics program. So you just have to seek it out. And as I said, on our website, Power of Civics is a really great start. If you read through all of those tabs, all of those 45 items, it will be a good start. I'm hoping to raise some funding so that I can make that into an online class, but next year after the election.
Thank you so much. And now we have a question from backstage. For the students, why are you interested in civics, and do you have friends that are also engaged? We can start with, what about Aryan?
I've just always been interested in like civics and history. I'm just interested in how humanities, how government works, how people interact, the best form of government is. I have a couple friends that are also engaged, but most of them not too much in civics.
Thank you so much, and I'll pass that over to Aislinn.
I'm interested in civics. I just, since probably the 2016 election, because that was the first time I actually had a memory of an election, and it was such a divisive one that it kind of drew me to the topic. And now that I'm old enough, it's really nice to be able to get involved in politics, especially since it's something I want to go into in the future. And civic engagement is the best way to interact with it, while not being able to vote. Most of my friends that are involved in or interested in civics are interested in it because it's something I talk about constantly. Other than that, not really. My friends aren't super interested in it, except for like the fact that I've discussed it with them.
Thank you. Let's hear from Joseph.
I'm definitely very interested in civics. I've always been from a young age. I would call myself more of like a history geek a little bit. So I care a lot about what's going on in my community and things that are going on and how we can make a change for ourselves. So me and my family believe that it's our country, so it's our power. So it really starts with us and what we do, what we need to do in our community to make the world generally just like a better place. And for my friends, I also have a couple friends that are interested in civics, but it's more so me letting them know like we can be more than just athletes, more than just students. Like we need to care about what's going on in our community and how we can make a change at our young age right now.
Thank you for your great response. And we can conclude that with Ryan.
Like when it comes to like civics, it's always been like a thing in my household. Like I could always hear like my grandparents talking about it, and then my mom would come and like it would be like a whole conversation in the house. But like I myself never really tuned into it too much until my freshman year at high school, and that's when like I first had my physics class, and that's when I kind of got like interested in not physics, civics, my fault. That's what I got interested in like that topic. Most of my friends though, they're not really like too interested in it though. So
those are all great responses. It seems that there's still work to be done with civic engagement in the youth, but I'm glad that there are other youth involved in civics. So now, if we're just going to leave the room open for any questions that any of you might have, perhaps I believe Joseph.
Yeah, that's no problem. So my question is, there are many people in Connecticut who are not U.S. citizens but still contribute to the local economies. Since they're unable to vote, how would you suggest that they engage in their communities without fear of deportation if they're undocumented?
It's a good question and slightly outside of my area of expertise. Obviously, I don't think anyone should put their safety at risk, but um, my answer is the same for everyone. The power of civics. Even, the good thing is you can attend a town meeting virtually if you have to, right? Or you can go and um, uh, as long as it's safe for you to go, you can just go and sit in and hear what's being talked about. You can always write to any elected person, an email, a letter, make a phone call. And these are ways that every single person can make their voice heard. And again, I like to underscore this because we focus on politics and not governance. We tend to think of using your voice as it relates only to someone we elected. And I've seen this with parties as well. When I was running for state representative, I used to go to houses with the lawn sign of my opponent. And they would be like, oh, I'm the other party. And I said, well, if I get elected, I would represent you too. And wouldn't you rather I hear what your concerns are? So undocumented young people, etc. You don't have to be a voter to weigh in on policies. So that's part of the reason I try to separate the two in our thought process.
Thank you. And I think that Arian also has a question.
Yeah, I also actually had a follow up on my last question. You discussed how we could focus less on the politics and more on governance. But I think a big part of that is in elections, we tend to focus a lot on the people and not the issues they're talking about or their positions. We just talk about it's just ad hominem the entire election, especially nowadays. So do you think there's really a way we could help steer that back towards issue-based elections instead of people-based?
Yeah, I mean, we can, right? I'll give you an example. When I was running for Secretary of the State, which is an elected position, but at the end of it, there's a job. You have to run an agency. There are lots of employees. We were responsible for implementing early voting and so many other things. So it's an elected position, but there's a job. And when I was running, I was at the convention and I gave a speech. And one part of that speech was in all the months I was running, in 6 months, not one person asked to see my resume. No, actually, it wasn't true. One person asked to see my resume. No one asked about my management degree. I had run a company. No one asked to talk to my former employees. No one asked anything about any of the skill sets that would be required to run an agency. Everyone asked about how I felt about policy or, certain things that I happen to think were not as relevant because I could love policy as much as I wanted to, but if I didn't know how to run an agency, the likelihood of that policy getting enacted would be nil. So that's why I always say the only people we can change are ourselves. So we can't put it all on candidates, political parties. We have to do better as constituents, as voters. If we start asking better questions, I do think we'll get better answers. Or if you don't get better answers, that in and of itself is the answer you need as a voter. And can I, Arlene, I saw one thing in the chat that I do want to talk about. In the Connecticut legislature, over the past, I'd say 5 years, two bills have been introduced many times. One that I've introduced that would allow 16-year-olds to pre-register to vote, so that on your 18th birthday, it's already done, because a lot of 16-year-olds are getting their driver's license. I think there are now like 15 states that do this. There's also been a bill, like is also done in about 11 states, that allows 16-year-olds to vote in certain local elections. And what I find interesting is that I don't think anyone in that age bracket, or very few people, have ever shown up to testify on that bill or send emails about that bill, etc. And I give that as an example because I do talk to a lot of young people who are like, I would love to have a voice, but until we start seeing anybody, but young people too, using the voice that they do have, systems will not change to cater to them, right? Like I could imagine if like 2016-year-olds showed up and said, hey, I want to be able to pre-register or vote, it would be taken with a different level of seriousness compared to if 3 people show up. So numbers matter in politics, not as much in governance, but numbers definitely matter. So once we elect people, showing up to support them, showing up to, we live in a representative democracy, but people don't know how to represent us if we don't talk to them. So it's really important that we exercise that right, because most people in the world don't have that right, or many people, I should say.
I actually have a question about that because I was just thinking about, like pre-registering because I'm not 18 yet. And I was like kind of wanting to. How can someone show support for the bill exactly? Like, who could they contact in order to make their voice heard?
Sure. You can learn all about this in the Power of Civics. This is like my commercial. So the tricky thing about the state legislature, you have to understand about 3,000 to 4,000 bills are introduced every single year. But in the General Assembly website, cga.ct.gov, they have a bill tracker. So you could go in and you have to sign up, but you can say, like, you can put in a subject, 16-year-olds, I don't know, or 16-year-old pre-registration. And then anytime a bill or that topic comes up, you can get an email about it. It's actually pretty easy. You can also go to the same website and do a bill search and look at all the bills that have already been introduced on that topic in the past. And then you'll also see who co-sponsored those bills. So maybe it's someone in the delegation in your town, and you can reach out to them and say, hey, I love that bill. Will you bring it back? And if they, or you can reach out to a member in another town if they sponsored a bill and say, like, how can I help you get this passed when the session starts in January? So there are many different ways you can get involved. You can bring it up as a question at candidate debates, just to start the dialogue going. Numbers matter, and talking about issues really matter in sort of this political sphere, because there are so many topics there. A lot of people get a bad idea, like politicians get voted in and then they don't do anything. And that, I think, that may be true, but I think it's a false narrative. I explain it this way. Like, there are 6 of us here. If I were to ask, each of us would probably care about different issues: affordable housing, climate, gun violence prevention, whatever. Like, we all would have different priorities. So let's say we all got elected by people who support our priorities. And then we get to the legislature, and we all need lots of money to get our priority adopted. But the money is limited. So then all 6 of us have to debate and figure out who's going to get the money. And it's not that we aren't trying, but the money is finite. So if I show up with 2,000 people behind me, I'm more likely to get the money. If, Arlene, you're just like there, like, hey, I think people want this thing, but I have no backup. So that's why it's really important that we show up and use our voice all the time.
Thank you so much. It looks like Ryan also has a question, if he wants to ask that.
Yeah. My question is for example, like me in Bridgeport now, like is there a way, like what are the ways to make sure my voice is like heard in Hartford, like when it comes to decision making and things like that?
It's a long distance. I live in Norwalk, so I won't advocate you drive up to Hartford all the time. But one of the benefits that came out of the pandemic is that public hearings are available on Zoom, even by telephone, and you can always email your legislators. You can also write letters, but email is more direct. So there's no reason you can't reach out to whoever represents you in Hartford and set up. I mean, people don't realize, like most state senators, state representatives, if you reach out to them and say, hey, can we set up a 15-minute phone call to talk about something, or can we meet for a coffee? That is the beauty of Connecticut. Like compared to other states, larger states, they'll do it. They often have community hours or office hours where anyone can come by and talk about issues. I used to have office hours, and like I think in all the weeks I had it, like 2 or 3 people showed up. But like elected people in Connecticut are much more accessible compared to larger states where you couldn't possibly travel, the distances. Like everyone can make it to the Capitol in about an hour and 20 minutes at most.
Thank you so much. And I believe Aislinn has a question as well.
Yes. So I know that around, like nationally, we saw a large spike in the voter registration numbers very recently, and I was wondering if that's reflected in Connecticut with young people, because I know young people were a lot of that group. And as a follow-up to that, what do you think, if we have seen that, what do you think we've been doing right? And if we haven't, what do you think we've been doing wrong?
I wish I had that data. I don't. I usually get my reports the first of the month. So I've actually been waiting to see what the October 1st report will show. We definitely did have an increase in August, but I don't remember the year over year and how different it was. But I do think we're doing a lot right in Connecticut, although there's not a lot of coordination. There are a ton of groups from, like I said, Legal Women Voters, NAACP, a lot of grassroots groups, community centers, sororities, fraternities. There's so many different entities, businesses even, who are doing voter registration events, who are doing civic engagement, sort of civic education events. So it really does depend on where you live and how much effort those are. How much effort, most of these are volunteer run groups, so sometimes they're limited in what they can do. But the work is out there, but it can be hard to find. But if you start looking around for it, I bet you'll find there's more happening in all of these towns than you might know about.
So much. Aryan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask follow up on the General Assembly bills. Do you think it would be a good idea for the automatic pre-registration to vote? Like you get when you're born, like you get your birth certificate, you get your social security card, you're pre-registered to vote, because you don't have to like sign up for jury duty. You have to mandatorily sign up for the military. Why should voting be any different when it's the basis of our whole country? And second of all, I would just like to mildly disagree on the 16-year-olds being able to vote, because I just think about how much I've grown since, like, even in the past year, and how much I'll still grow in the next year, and some of my peers voting and I'd feel more comfortable voting if they were 18. And yeah, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, it's not a disagreement. As you may have heard me say, I introduced a bill for pre-registration, but other people have introduced a bill for 16-year-olds to actually vote.
Yeah.
I'm not in support of that. I would support it if it came with a very robust civic education sort of process. But to your oh my gosh, I totally forgot. Your other question was about
like getting pre-registered.
voting, pre-registering.
Like
You know,
as
it's
soon as you're born.
interesting.
Yeah.
Some countries do that. I think it's a great idea, but I'm not sure. It becomes complicated in the United States because every state runs its own elections. It's not a federal system. And the countries who do that, I think there's more control. So, like, imagine you're born in Connecticut, and then your family moves to Wyoming, and then you go to college in California, and then I think it becomes complicated in the US. I've not looked into the research on this, but I suspect that's part of the issue. There's no funding to like actually track people through that process.
I would also like to add on 16-year-olds being able to vote. I know you. I would also like. I don't think you should be able to vote if you're like you can't sign a contract, but you're voting. Like you're not. You're still a minor, so like yeah.
This is the beauty. Like we all have opinions. I don't disagree with you, but other people would disagree with both of us. I've had those debates with some 16-year-olds. And, you know, this is why numbers matter when policy is being enacted. Like that is the way we vote, right? After the election with our voices and whatever most people want typically wins out if they show up.
Wonderful. And now we're going to move on to some Facebook questions. So we have one from Yolan Chapman Ford. What is the cutoff date for voter registration and absentee voting in Connecticut?
Okay, all election law is very complicated and wonky, so I'll try to give the simple version. But myvote.ct.gov is where you go for all Connecticut trusted election information. So for the upcoming election, the voter registration cutoff date is October 18th. The time of day depends on how you're registering, whether it's online, in person, at the DMV, or through the mail. So I won't get into those details, but it's all October 18th. For absentee voting, there's not a real cutoff per se, but you want to, if you plan to vote by absentee through the mail, you want to make sure you are providing enough time so I think everyone knows absentee ballots are a two-step process. You have to apply. Once the town clerk verifies you as an eligible voter, you are then sent the ballot, you vote it, and you return it. So you have to have your ballot back by the close of polls on election day. So that's 8 p.m. But if you, like, election day is a Tuesday, if you try to mail your ballot on Friday, chances are it's not going to get there on time. So there's not a deadline per se, but I would recommend that if it's a week before the election, you drop it off in person with your town clerk or at the drop box. And I think everyone knows, or maybe not, there are a lot of regulations about who can and can't return your absentee ballot. So I recommend that everyone read up on that so they can help family members or friends who are voting. Because basically it's limited to your immediate family or certain designated authorities. So if I happen to live next door to Ryan and I say, hey, I'm going to drop off my absentee ballot, and he says, can you take mine too? No, that would be illegal. Election law, most people, and this is civic education too, most people like vote the first time at a certain age. And then they think nothing changes in elections throughout their entire life. They don't realize that different laws get passed like almost every year. So just like any other type of education, it pays to stay up with what has changed in elections.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Believe it or not, we are almost completed. And before I go out, I just want to show this. We have like 2 minutes to address this, Secretary. And it's a question that I hear often. I have my own answer, but I'd love to hear what you would say about this.
What would I say? Actually, this might be unexpected. I do get this question from many different types of people who like, oh, our democracy feels like everything just feels so negative. And we can only change ourselves. And I always ask, what are you doing to improve that situation? I used to feel that way when I was younger. I like to say, growing up Black, I often felt like government was not there for me, that my needs were not being taken into account. But I've learned that's not true. It was up to me to do a little more, get more involved. I can't feel discouraged if I haven't even tried to make the change. So I think with action comes excitement and inspiration sometimes. And I have, since I've entered this realm of getting more involved, I feel better about the world, not worse.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My mother asks me how I can continue doing this work. She's 91. What are you doing? And I say, and I'm looking at this screen right now, it's the young people that I work with. They bring me hope, all of you. I'm so proud and so excited for this. I know this could have continued longer. So on behalf of the Connecticut Cradle to Career Coalition, Bridgeport Prospers, Danbury Collective, Norwalk Acts, Stanford Cradle to Career, and Waterbury Bridge to Success, I thank our esteemed Secretary Thomas for her time, passion, and commitment, and our 5 students for their time, energy, and enthusiasm. Our coalition partnerships represent much of the unseen work that is done in communities across Connecticut and the country. Collaborations envisioning, as we do, every child and young person flourishing and participating in healthy, equitable, thriving communities. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good night.
Thank you. You guys were wonderful.